and the Filipinos. Good morning again. Good morning again. Welcome back for yet again an extraordinary presentation by Professor Stefan Bouzarovski. We asked Professor Bouzarovski to come and present his work to the entitled Network last year, September, October, something like that. And Stefan immediately responded enthusiastically and positively. He didn't have to do so. That was a time he was still Professor of Geography at Birmingham University. But we thought that his work fitted well with our theoretical, political, and academic project. I'm now happy to announce that Professor Bouzarovski is now one of our colleagues and is now, since the 1st of January, Professor of Geography here in the School of Environment and Development. As you know, Dr. Gavin Bridge has been appointed to a chair at Durham University. So he's leaving us, although he will stay involved in the entire project. And we're lucky to have Professor Bouzarovski now with us. So if we are asking him again next time, it would be much more difficult for him to consider the possible no.
Now for another university.
So, Professor Bouzarovski is Professor of Geography at the University of Manchester, and he was previously Professor of Geography at the University of Birmingham. He is also a visiting professor for the Geography section of the Faculty of Science at Charles University in Prague, the Czech Republic, as well as at the Department of Economic Geography at the University of Gdansk in Poland. He is the author of Energy Poverty in Eastern Europe, Hidden Geographies of Deprivation. He has published a wide range of articles on issues of transnational energy flows, social inequality, and urban transformation in post-socialism in a number of international peer-reviewed journals. He holds doctoral and master's degrees in respectively economic geography and environmental management from the University of Oxford. And he will talk to us about energy transitions and vulnerability. Stefan, it's our pleasure to have you here.
Right, well, thank you, Eric. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I just have to start with an apology, I suppose, because I'm keeping everyone here on the one sunny hour in Manchester of the year. So
they know you're lying, they've been sunny the whole week.
Yeah. And then it's cold. So maybe you've arranged this, I don't know. Very, very good organisation. But anyway, I'll try to keep you animated as much as I can, and I'll try to also make this a bit more, well, kind of interactive as well, so there'll be questions thrown back at you as well. Now, this is a slightly different maybe lecture from most of the things you've heard until now, because I will talk about energy, or what I like to call the geography of energy, but also the political ecology of energy. And one of the problems I've had in working in this field is that there really isn't a clear political ecology of energy. So we're actually creating a field of energy political ecology as we speak. And so it's a very exciting endeavour, but it's an endeavour that's quite difficult in the sense of actually defining what the political in energy is, uniquely in energy as such, because obviously there's the different components of the energy systems which have been seen through a political ecology lens, from aspects of consumption to aspects of production. So the very interesting work on renewables, or interesting work on nuclear power, but nothing integrated, nothing that puts together all these perspectives and considers energy as a whole. So that's the kind of thing I'll try to do. And I'll use these two concepts, energy transitions and energy vulnerability, as entry points into that endeavour, just to get us thinking about actually what a political ecology of energy might sound like. So I'm really excited to be here, because I think that's something we can start thinking about and building as we work together in this lecture and we start have that discussion. Right, now I don't know how well you can see this, so I'm just going to turn the light off a little bit. The time of this lecture is remarkable because actually something amazing happened yesterday. And there are these photos here which show it. Actually yesterday, the entire Bulgarian government resigned en masse because of protests over the price of electricity. So the protest over the price of electricity had been going on for about a month. They got quite violent in the end. They got quite massive at the end. So 25 people had to be taken into hospital. The opposition left the parliament the week before. There were several resignations from ministers. And in the end, the government resigned. And as you can see on some of these photos, up there is are the vehicles of the electricity company, which is an Austrian company, EVN, distribution company, burnt. And just to the left here, it says Czech Pirates, and there's a kind of, the light bulb spells out the Czech utility, the acronym of the Czech utility, ČEZ, which owns also part of the distribution network. So in many ways, the protests were not just about the price of electricity, which has gone up very dramatically in recent years, but they were very much also about the privatization of the electricity sector. So this man is holding a piece of paper saying, "We won't pay." So they don't feel that this is unjust, and they don't feel that it is fair to be transferring money into these big capital utilities which now control the Bulgarian energy sector. For me, this is remarkable because it actually, you can discuss the conditions under which this happened, but it really hasn't happened until now that a popular movement of discontent around energy has had such deep political implications anywhere in the world. Which is not to say that protest over energy or the price of energy or the provision of energy and political discontent around that hasn't been present in other contexts. So a lot of the protests we've seen in the recent year across Europe, also in the United States, even places like Australia, New Zealand, not to mention South America, have been around energy. So it is becoming a kind of mobilizing topic in many ways for people to act, because there is a dynamic of, they feel, of dispossession. There's a sense of energy being taken out of their control. So that kind of brings me to the starting points of this lecture, which are basically three. And the first starting point is that what we've experienced in the last 20 or 30, maybe 40 years, across, actually at a global scale, so in the developed world but also in the developing world, is the breakdown of what one might call a Keynesian model of energy provision. Keynesian, what do I mean by that? Basically, post-World War II, energy utilities, if they were in private hands, they were largely nationalized in developed world countries, and there were more or less integrated systems of energy provisions, both vertically and horizontally. So you basically have one utility providing the services, generating electricity or different types of energy and transmitting it as well. Parallel to that, of course, there was generally a Keynesian welfare system that supported those who couldn't afford those services, and there were also forms of housing provision and so on that ensured that there was some kind of a system whereby there was at least some sort of social contract in the provision of electricity, or energy for that matter. You know, simplifying here very greatly, but I'm just trying to get the point across that this no longer exists. So even though maybe that didn't exist even in an ideal situation, that certainly does not exist now at all. And this is as far as the developed world is concerned. In developing countries, we have a different situation in that their electricity, even though, for example, in some cases there was state-led energy provision, the neoliberalization of the energy system came in even earlier, thanks to things like the World Bank and the IMF, and of course the post-socialist countries like Bulgaria are also a case of that neoliberal system coming in. So what we have really in the last 20 or 30 years is basically a kind of Thatcherist formula for what needs to happen in the energy sector. And I'm saying Thatcherist because it was actually pioneered in this country, which really meant that you break up companies in the energy sector, you break them up into the different functions of the energy chain. So you say there are going to be these companies that will generate the energy, these companies that will transmit it, other companies will distribute it. Then you try to introduce competition, so you open up the market. You also introduce price competition, and the other thing you do is you kind of set up a nominally independent regulator. So that's the kind of the formula which we're beginning to see at a global scale in terms of energy provision. And that is raising all kinds of issues which are becoming quite interesting now. And of course, one of the issues, which is my second point, is there's an immense amount of inequality in the provision of energy. And that inequality is not just produced by the existing system, but actually it is inherited. It is inherited from almost from the whole of the from the whole of the 20th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, North America and Europe consumed 98% of the world's commercial energy. So that's the kind of situation that was inherited back then. So actually, inequalities in energy have a historical path-dependent basis, and they have been partly ameliorated in the sense that by the 1980s, these two continents consumed only 70% of the global energy, but that still is a staggering amount of inequality. So again, from a political ecology perspective, for me, these two considerations have to be taken into account, and they're not sufficiently taken into account into debates on energy. Especially because the third kind of point, which tends to dominate the debates nowadays, is this demand for moving towards a low-carbon future, driven by, of course, largely the imperative of climate change. So if you look at what the debates around energy are at the moment, they're not about these two, they're partly about these two issues, so perhaps the first one, not necessarily the second one, but they're dominated discursively by the low-carbon imperative. But that low-carbon imperative, as I will argue later in the lecture, is inherently a capitalist, is inherently part of capitalist contradiction, and is a product of the capitalist mode of production anyway. So what the debate basically around these questions, around especially low carbon transition, and I think generally around energy, it creates what I would call false dichotomies. So one perspective that a political ecologist, in my view, would need to have on energy, or a critical geographer would need to have on energy, is to actually see beyond these rather false binaries, these very polarized view, which dominate a lot of, not just the media, but a lot of academic discourse, especially in social environmental science. The first such false dichotomy, and it was on the news here in Britain just 2 nights ago, I was amazed that they brought it up again, is that renewable energy is expensive. Therefore, if we have a lot more renewable energy in the system, it will result in fuel poverty. So always in the image of the public, fuel poverty is when prices increase, people can't afford. I'm going to talk about that later. People can't afford energy. So in the eyes of the public, the way it's presented is we can't have a low carbon transition without some people having to pay for it, particularly those who are vulnerable. That's the one kind of a dichotomy. Another dichotomy, which is very much present in the public and in the way energy is conceptualized, is that centralized forms of energy provision, particularly nuclear power, are an inherent, and this is perhaps more UK than it is Europe, but not in all countries. Certainly not in countries like, certainly in countries like France and Sweden, we get the same debate. You need a kind of centralized big forms of energy provision, like nuclear power, supported by the state through state subsidies, in order to ensure that the lights don't go out. And this discourse of the lights going out is something that just you keep hearing in the media here. We need this because there's going to be an immense catastrophe coming up, and this comes back to some of the points you've raised before in your work, and it's very much part of not just the climate debate, but also the energy debate and the energy provision debate. And of course, these are both of these, I would argue, are completely constructed viewpoints. Neither are we facing a scarcity of energy, and neither are we facing a situation where we have to choose between blackouts and nuclear power. There's an entirely constructed viewpoint. There's plenty of energy at the moment in the world, it's just not distributed properly. The questions around energy are purely distributional, procedural, and questions of recognition. They're not questions of actual technical and social provision of energy. Which brings me actually to one of the arguments which I want to make today, which is that the choice of energy provision is a primarily political choice. It is about the kind of society we want to have. It is not a technical choice. So who you recognize as being deserving of energy provision, how you recognize them, and through which procedures you recognize them politically, and what sort of distributional mechanism you use will ultimately determine the kind of system that you have. So energy is inherently bound up in the type of society that we have. And the other two arguments I want to make today in this lecture, the first one really is that the changing, and this is from Matt Huber, I'm just developing that further. Matt Huber is a political ecologist type person in the States, and he's a great guy, and he wrote an interesting paper about hydrocarbons and capitalism. I think I put it in the reading list. And I would just like to develop that argument further, which I would say basically that the changing nature of energy provision has been a central component of the contradiction with capitalism that we see. So we can't think of capitalism and its historical development without thinking about energy and how different types of energy throughout history created particular types of society. So actually, a large part of my lecture will be devoted to actually unpacking this a little bit and giving you some examples of that. And the other thing I'd like to talk about is these two concepts of transition and vulnerability. So I'll get to them and what they mean, but basically, if we think of transitions as the movement from one type of energy to another in history, well, the argument I want to make is that through every transition there have been various political and economic dislocations. And those dislocations have created new types of vulnerability, so they've impacted different groups throughout different periods of time. So again, that brings me here, which is that the decision about what kind of transition you want to have through time has been an inherently political one. Right. So obviously, the very obvious point is when you start talking about this is actually to look at what our current energy makeup looks like, where we get our energy from at the moment. And, well, it's a fairly straightforward picture. Oil. It's the dominant energy resource on the planet at the minute. 32%. With coal being very significant at about 27%, natural gas, and then all the rest, the Cinderella options as they call them, with some nuclear mixed in for fun. So obviously what comes through immediately, and that's something that we've talked about, is that basically, it kind of brings me to the second point. We live in a high energy civilization based on the consumption and the combustion of fossil fuels. So what we have done as a society over the last few centuries, we've converted the chemical energy of biogenic sedimentary rocks in the earth into useful energy services. And we've undertaken as a society a tremendous endeavor at a tremendous scale And that has created the kind of civilization that we have today. The problem, of course, with all of that is that because that has been inherently bound up in the kind of capitalist society that we created, those energy flows, those energy mobilizations have undermined the existence of capitalism as such. And that's the kind of argument that's another argument that I want to make today. They've undermined them in different ways. So in that sense, they're part of those contradictions of capitalism. They both help reproduce it, but also undermine it at the same time. So they undermine it through the notion of resource nationalism, the fact that that resources are inherently bound up, are increasingly bound up within nation-state context, and yet are part of a global circulation of energy. They're bound up within these socio-technical transitions, which themselves create new contradictions, create new problems for the providers of energy every time they're established, and require further mobilization of these resources rather than a decreased mobilization of resources. So the problems that capitalism is creating by mobilizing all of these energies, it's not resolving them, it's just requiring more energy to do that. And going back to this third point, of course, is environmental implications. Environmental implications in terms of actually impacting nature, impacting the physical environment, and dealing with those environmental problems creates new issues. And certainly within resource nationalism and the whole question around accessing, or actually ensuring energy access, one of the biggest problems, one of the biggest issues that you might argue is linked to all of this is the whole question of conflict and war. So tell me one major war in the 20th century that hasn't been fought over energy, and we can have a discussion about that. But tell me a recent one at least, and especially how oil is bound up in this, obviously in this capitalist system. Very general arguments, I don't want to go into them, but I just want to put them out there, which I think is important to do. So obviously what's happening is we are rapidly increasing our energy supply. Our energy supply has increased from basically from 71 to 2010, it has more than doubled. But different things have changed in a different pace. So if you look at, for example, gas, we've got a lot more gas in our energy balance as a global scale. We don't have much oil, but interestingly, we have more coal. So I want to unpack some of these different energy resources and how they've changed the nature of our societies over time. Okay, I'm going to skip that because we don't have much time. So what I want to say, first of all, is that just obviously we don't have a static picture in our societies. These trends constantly change, and they correspond to the transforming nature of energy demand, and they embody and influence wider trends. And when we have a movement from one dominant source to another, that's what we call an energy transition. So obviously, part one of this lecture is about these past and present energy transitions. Right, so energy transition. So I'm going to cite various work here, mostly historical work on energy transition. People like Václav Smil in particular, that's where I've derived some of this research, and also there's an article by Gavin Bridge and myself and others in the reading list, which talks about the contemporary spatial and partly also political implications of energy transitions. So what we have really with energy transitions is we've had basically three major energy transitions in our history as humans. The first transition really occurred when Watt invented the steam engine. The invention of the steam engine basically paved the road for the widespread use of coal as an energy source. Prior to that, basically, we mainly relied on biomass and on the muscular power of animals as society. I should point out that there was one sort of tiny transition just before that, which actually is based, it was actually associated with the domestication of animals. So the very establishment of human societies, the movement from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies, actually in itself involved an energy transition, because the muscular power of animals became a much more important role took a much more important role in the energy balance of human societies. So obviously, the first transition was from biomass to coal. Coal became very important by the end of the 19th century. And the other thing that happened at the same time, and I'm kind of now going slightly into Maria territory here, which is obviously the invention of electricity. And electricity revolutionized society, revolutionized urban landscape. And partly also because of being a highly versatile, very controllable, and very efficient fuel. So there's some really interesting work here by people like David Nye and Thomas Hughes. This is mainly work in STS, in the studies of technology and science, which has an interesting political dimension to it, but it hasn't really been brought out enough, I think, especially in terms of its significance to contemporary societies. Okay, I'm just going to skip that. But basically, what electricity did, and it still does, it changed the nature of space. It changed the use of private space, it changed the use of domestic space, but also public space. So the notion of public space having a political purpose, having an economic purpose, actually is very much bound up in many ways with the production of electricity and the presence of lit landscapes in the evening. Not to mention, of course, the revolutionizing of manufacturing and commerce. If you look at the world at night, you can see actually the most important impact of humans on this planet. The most visible impact of humans on this planet is light, because that's the one thing you can see from space immediately. And certainly in terms of electricity, it changed the nature of existing previous urban landscapes, so it allowed power to be projected across distances. It's implicated in the way cities were constructed. They were constructed so as to project light at night. Even in more modern times, I mean, if you look at New York, the Empire State Building, the way that the colors change to signify a different thing every evening, depending on the mood. And in the background, I've got the two beams of light that were put in during the World Trade Center, after World Trade Center bombing. All of those cases really signify how the electrification of urban landscapes had a very, very significant implication on how our whole society basically functioned. At the same time, of course, coal declined as an energy resource. So the 20th century basically tells us the story of coal going down in its use. It had low energy content, it was voluminous, it was difficult to transport. And it's got all kinds of harmful environmental implications and so on. I'm not going to talk about that a lot. But one thing I will say, which is that if you look at the energy balance of coal, so total primary energy supply, coal is still present from 1970 until today. So actually coal has not declined as much as we expected. So actually what has happened in recent years is coal has resurged. Coal has resurged because of actually global disbalances in the way, in the energy transition process. So there is the fact that some countries experience these energy transitions earlier versus others, the discontinuity of those processes allowed coal to emerge, particularly in places like China, India, and so on. Also bound up in this is the emergence of another energy resource, which is gas, which is basically cheap gas in the United States. Again, very much for political purposes, for the purposes of securing domestic energy supply. That in itself displaced the coal from the United States, moved it to other countries, made it quite cheap resource. So what I would say here is that the second rise of coal, the rise of coal in the last 20 years, actually talks about the uneven nature of capitalist development. It reveals the contradictions of capitalist development, which it helped create in the first place. So in a way, coal, you can think of coal as the fuel that made capitalism in many ways. We couldn't have contemporary capitalism if we didn't have coal. And then we get on to another fuel, oil. Sorry, this is just a picture of new coal-burning power plants in China, which are spreading very quickly. We can talk about this later. But anyway, getting on to oil. So if there is a fuel that made capitalism, it's coal. But if there's a fuel that made globalization, it's oil. So the globalization of capital, the globalization of, as we know it, the globalization of people movements, of people and capital, would have been impossible without the rise of this new resource, which offers something that coal doesn't. It offers flexibility. It offers a much higher energy content, so it packs energy into a smaller space. Benefited from all kinds of possibilities, directional rotary drilling, benefited from technical advances that allowed marginal resources in the Earth's crust to be mobilized once again to enter these circulations of energy at a much higher pace during the whole of the 20th century. To a situation where the production, the daily production, at the moment equals the whole of the world's production in oil in 1900. So we now produce more, basically on a daily basis, we produce as much as the whole world produced in about 100 years ago. Two major things happened: automobility and air travel, impossible without this energy resource. And you can again think about all of the different dimensions that created afterwards. But again, the whole issue of greenhouse gas, again, the problem coming with that energy resource. Just different types of drilling, again, I'm just going to skip this. Interestingly enough, oil created a new set of disbalances in the global economy. Again, these are things we've discussed a lot, but perhaps that haven't been explicitly linked to energy, the geographies of energy in particular. So whereas, if we go back to coal, it's very much a northern hemisphere resource. I'll kind of throw a question at you. Do you think that this map is accurate? What do you notice about this map?
The absence of the Arctic and Antarctic as possible coal reserves?
That's one thing, but there's something else about actually how the coal reserves are represented.
Continuous, as continuous and not fragmented.
Yes, they've generalized them, but there is something else. The size. What about the size of the continents?
It seems to me that the northern part of the hemisphere is going to be stretched.
Yes, because they're using the Mercator projection.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're using the Mercator projection to amplify the coal reserves. This is from the Coal Federation. I thought to show you the map, just to see how particular power interests still dominates, still try to actually capture this space of coal, where actually sizable reserves still exist. But where these reserves are is where industrial revolution, anyway, at least in Europe particularly, started. There are still sizable reserves, however, in places like Australia and North America. So obviously what we have with oil is a very different type of geography. Oil is located in a very different set of countries. This is a kind of, we call it a cartogram. Sort of emphasizing different sizes of countries according to where the reserves are, and then emphasizing then the color just tells you which countries consume all the oil. So if it's kind of more yellow, it's that country consumes more. So I think I don't need to discuss any further the reason for all the resource wars that we've seen and all the conflicts that we've seen in the last 20, 30 years. I think this map just tells you enough. But obviously, a whole set of new contradictions, a whole set of new problems associated with this. Now, of course, what happens is that the future of oil is also uncertain, and a lot of people has been linked to all kinds of. Again, there's an interesting literature around this, but there's a whole set of literatures which says that we are going to face an imminent crash in the future because of the decline of oil. So again, there's a kind of catastrophism around that, which has been proven time and time again to be incorrect. It has been proven to be incorrect because energy resources and energy use do not crash, and we see that from coal, we're beginning to see that from oil. There is just a reconfiguration of the system, moving from one type of energy to another, which creates problems for those who experience the transition, but it does not lead to a crash of the resource, and we can see that with coal, the fact that it is being resurging again. And actually what's really crucial in all of this, and something that's not being emphasized enough, which I argue is very crucial, is not the nature of supply, but is the nature of demand. It's the nature of what we need as a society and how we construct that need, which actually determines how we're going to use the resource, not the presence of the resource itself. So it's what we decide we need, it's what actually we move our society towards that matters in this context. So obviously, a lot of the environmental movement, a lot of them, and this whole limits to growth perspective and so on, these were very typical representations of peak oil, kind of what would happen after 1990, blackouts, candle and so on, but of course it hasn't proven to actually we use more oil now than we ever have, and we are discovering a new reserve. They're just becoming more expensive. They're just in more marginal parts of the world. That's all. Eventually it will peter out as we move out to different sources, and that different source is of course natural gas. So the third energy transition, which was meant to happen but isn't quite happening yet, is the one towards natural gas. So if you looked at most models, they expected that natural gas would dominate the total primary energy supply of the world by 2000. But the uptake of this fuel has been much slower. It has been much slower, actually not just due to physical issues around gas, but also very much due to the whole question of climate change and how that has been discussed and presented in the media, and of course political questions. So I'm not going to go into the debate around gas. There's all kinds of issues we could discuss here, but I'm just going to go on. This is some of the more recent research we've done in the project. We've explored the governance of gas, and this is just a map of all the European companies providing gas. It's a kind of network map. And one of the things that is very obvious still, also in the European context, but also at a global scale, is that we have a highly disconnected gas market at present. So what we actually have with natural gas is very much a non-globalizing market. There is a set of markets both in Asia, in America, and even in Europe, with a West European market on the one side and an East European market on the other. It has very much to do with the nature of the resource, which cannot easily be packed and sent out across large distances. It has to be piped in many cases, and that materiality of the resource is linked to a very specific economic structure, to a very specific political structure as well, which then impedes its development. But there is no doubt in my mind that eventually, because this is already there as indications of globalizing trends here, so eventually actually what will happen is that we're actually going to have a global market in gas sooner or later. And that does mean that prices actually, rather than going up, my view is that prices are likely to be coming down, as they already are with piped gas. So obviously all of these predictions about catastrophism and so on take a whole new light, especially of course with the rise of, which is quite momentous, with the rise of shale gas in the United States, with an absolute revolution there in terms of how much shale is produced, and of course with all the environmental consequences associated with that. But that is pushing so much more gas onto global market. Well, there's freeing up so much more gas onto global markets that these dichotomies, which I presented at the beginning, just make little sense. There's also the question of nuclear power, which again I don't want to go into very much, but a resource that was seen as something that would be too cheap to meter back in the 60s and the 70s. That was what we were told, but of course has proven to be one of the most expensive and problematic forms of centralized provision ever seen. And of course a resource primarily that I would say in terms of geography, in terms of ecology, actually is a highly concentrated resource, a resource that requires immense concentration of knowledge, of power, but also and it still has a very concentrated geography. Very few countries can actually produce it. As Andrew Lois has written, it has a moral dimension as well, because the time scales involved in the production of this resource and the disposal of waste are tremendous. They're greater than anything else in terms of any of the other resources we have. Contrary to, this is just a cartogram just showing where nuclear power is presented, but of course it's slightly out of date because that has both Germany and Japan just dwindled. So it's a source of power that's basically very likely to be on the way out. And there's renewables, and of course renewables is the final option that I'm going to discuss here. Quite the opposite of nuclear in the sense that the factor of exhaustion is very limited. The questions around concentration do not stand. Actually, renewables, the whole issue with them, and in terms of the politics of renewables, this is what makes them fascinating, is that they're incredibly diffuse, incredibly dispersed. They're highly spatial temporal variation. They vary in terms of where they are, they vary in terms of time, and some of them have massive environmental costs. Well, they're not massive, but they have extensive impacts on the landscape, especially large hydropower, whereas others require high capital costs. I mean, did I have a photo here? Yes, I hope you can see it. It's one of the wind farms which has caused a lot of problems in Scotland because it's right over the Grampian Mountains, and one of the solutions for that, I don't think you can see it very well, maybe just a little bit, the white sticks there, took it from the airplane, and then one of the solutions, of course, I don't know if you can see the white sticks here, is that part of that wind farm which just moved quite far offshore with a lot of capital costs associated with that. So just to kind of flag up some of these questions here. So if we think about in an integrated way all of this, we can think about basically, let's say these kind of three energy transitions, biomass, coal, or gas. We have the whole question from movement of primary energy to secondary energy. Secondary energy, of course, electricity, so it's not derived directly from any other resources, but it's a more technologically advanced form of energy. The other form of secondary energy that we have, of course, is petrol for driving cars. Nuclear, which is obviously not going to happen, very likely, and renewables. So obviously the kind of future that we're going to have in terms of energy becomes inherently political and inherently interesting just in light of this. Because we know that eventually we're going to have to get here as a society, but the path to which we get there is the big question. How much gas, how much oil, and how much coal we're going to be using up to the point where we come to the stage where we are fully renewable, because ultimately we cannot exist as societies on an immense timescale on these non-renewable resources. Is a question open for political debate, and this is where the political debate happens in our societies. This is where, of course, there are possibilities for further discussion. But in terms of, I'm going to skip through this just because it's technical innovations. It's interesting, but we could discuss it later. But in terms of actually what energy transitions have done in the past, and if we evaluate what they've done, I'd just like to bring you to the second point here, which is that the contradictions that they are embedded in, particularly in fossil fuel transitions, war violence, local socio-ecological degradation, suburban sprawl, a very tangible effect of oil particularly, and global climate change have been inherent to the production of capitalism. And what they've done really is in each case, they've led to the scrapping into the reorganization of old infrastructure and the introduction of new material links and new social practices. So every time there has been a transition, that has meant that there have been all kinds of dislocations happening. And those dislocations have, as I'm going to talk about later, have all sorts of social implications. Think of the decline of coal in Europe is a very good example. Which regions had the decline of coal and what that meant for those regions. Think of potentially what will happen when when oil becomes not perhaps such an important resource, whereas gas now is becoming. So every time that's happening, and that's also true for low carbon, we get a new set of relations emerging. And of course, there's a reordering. There's a reordering that's a political reordering. New people become powerful and influence the process. But there's a spatial reordering, there's a social reordering. So I'm just going to leave the energy transitions there for a minute. Yeah, this is kind of, I thought it was quite interesting, the sort of, the disjuncture that also happens with these transitions. And the fact that the transitions are not simultaneous, that they happen in different places, in different... Sorry, do you have a question?
Oh, no.
Okay, but if anyone wants to interrupt me, by the way, you can. That actually there isn't a single loop at which these transitions happen yet at the global scale. Right, just going on to the whole question of inequalities in energy consumption, very briefly, because I want to keep it to, how much do you want to keep it? Yeah, okay.
Another 15 minutes.
So obviously the sort of the second point which I wanted to make today, which again is something that just isn't made enough, is that as a global society we are facing tremendous inequalities in energy consumption. But those inequalities also extend to the way we live our everyday lives within the developed world as well. I mean, this is just that map which I showed you at the beginning, but just now adjusted as a population cartogram. And what it does show is that there are vast parts of the world, particularly Africa, but also Asia, which there's a lot of population, but they're dark at night. And that darkness is, well, it's there just to illustrate this point which I want to make here, which is that we're living in a situation at the moment where the World Bank says there are about 1.6 billion people without access to electricity. We have about 2.6 billion people who use biomass for cooking and heating. Which is a tremendous situation when you think about all these debates around low carbon and reducing our energy footprint. And that whole debate, there's a complete disjuncture between that debate and this. And this is actually something for me that is more pressing at this stage, the fact that we are in a situation where there's massive inequalities which haven't been addressed. Those inequalities are not just within, of course, between the developed and developing world. If you look at just within actual developed countries, we have a situation where in the United States, if your income is about 50,000, you would be consuming on average 65% more energy than those on less than 10,000 income. So that's the kind of difference that we see. Or the other thing about the United States is that basically we have a situation where about 5% of the population consume about 1/3 of the total primary energy supply. There's tremendous differences, especially if you think about the fact that North America is the big offender in terms of the global energy annual mean of energy with about 340 gigajoules. So we've got this whole situation of inequity. So I'm just going to skip through these. We can talk about them later. Some people have used Kuznets curves just to demonstrate how this works, and they've used them just to show, for example, how in countries like Kenya, for instance, energy consumption. So this is basically population goes. This is where cumulative population is on this graph, and your electricity consumption is on this. Basically, what you end up is that you get to 85% of the population, and they use only about 1% of energy, which is a very different profile from a country like Norway. So just go. Yeah. So one of the things that people have argued, and I think has to be part of a political ecology of energy, has to be part of understanding the global commons of energy in which we live, is that actually if you look at things like infant mortality, life expectancy, or human development indices, that going above 60 gigajoules per person, which is the annual mean for energy consumption, actually leads to significant increases in all of these indicators. So in other words, with the existing levels of energy resource use, if there was a redistribution of those energy levels of energy use, we could achieve dramatically different results in terms of actual improvement of quality of life. That's not something that is part of the debate. We always keep hearing how energy use needs to increase very rapidly in the developing world for that to happen. Well, and there's not enough energy. Well, that's not true. It's just the same argument that people like Amartya Sen made about hunger. It just hasn't been made about energy. But you can make it about energy, because if you just look at, well, there's some graphs here which you can see it, for example, with life expectancy, with illiteracy, with fertility, these kind of standard indicators of development, all of them plateau up to a certain level of energy. So you don't get radical improvements beyond a certain level. What's also interesting, of course, and that links more to my work, is that actually, aside from all of this, there's a whole problem of fuel poverty or energy poverty in the developed world. A situation where the things I talked about, the residual for this regime, increasing energy prices, partly under pressure supposedly from this low carbon transition, is creating a situation where a lot of people are unable to live in to access adequate energy service in the home, in developed countries as well. So one study we did last year, actually the year before, showed that basically there are at least 100 and possibly up to 200 million people in Europe alone who have inadequate energy services in the home. And this, I don't mean just heating, but also I mean cooling as well. Living in an inadequate energy services has all kinds of quality of life implications, have implications on mortality from stress, whatever, respiratory problems and so on. But also it has been shown to affect people's life chances. So it has all kinds of dimensions that are not part of the normal understanding of why we need energy in the home to be at an adequate level. And it has wide implications on the energy system, because we can't think of, and that's again, we talk about what an energy, political ecology of energy might involve. It has to be a multi-scalar effort, so it has to involve not just either the home or the general global commons of production or consumption. It has to involve multiple scales. So actually these problems expose how energy is fundamentally a multi-scalar problem. So one thing, for example, that's quite striking about Europe is a study from the World Health Organization about excess winter mortality. So basically it's how many people die in winter compared to other periods of the year. And so the assumption is that people die at a higher rate in winter because they don't have adequate heating, so they get colds and pneumonia and so on, and they suffer as a result. And what's interesting here is that, so this is the excess winter deaths. Even if we said that 25% of those deaths in winter are a result of inadequately heated homes, in many countries, even countries such as Germany, and countries like Romania as well, that figure is greater than the figure of people dying in transport accidents. But how many times do you hear about this kind of mortality in the media? How many times? When have you actually heard about this issue? So what the point I want to make, and this is some other research that we've done, just shows another point which I want to make in a minute, which is about basically the whole notion of infrastructural service instability experienced by those who suffer from fuel poverty. And this is just the temperature in a fuel poor home, where basically the temperature just oscillates very dramatically, hardly ever reaches 17 degrees. This is here in the UK. So the point I want to make here is that we need to go beyond. If we're going to start thinking about political ecology in terms of inequality of energy, we need to start going beyond these notions of developed world energy poverty or fuel poverty or developed world energy access. We need to go back to the whole question of access. And we need to think about the fact that the consequences of inadequate energy in the home or deprivation are the same. So you suffer social exclusion in society, whether you are in a developed or developing country as a result of inadequate energy services. And what is, again, the common issue here is that the nature in which we've hardwired the socio-technical landscape, the nature in which we've provided energy across across society and across the, let's say, urban or regional system, is fundamentally important to the production of energy insecurity. So people who suffer from this sort of deprivation are basically in a perpetual state of instability. Ultimately, this is always a question of political recognition, political action. So whether we're going to address these issues and how we produce them, it is not a technical issue. So one thing we've been trying to do here, and it's an endeavour that one of the reasons why I joined in Manchester, is actually to think of a notion of vulnerability, of energy vulnerability at a global scale, to understand what causes vulnerability and how it's experienced. We've kind of connected it to vulnerability frameworks, things like internal factors related to the energy producer, but also external factors related to social practice, energy affordability, efficiency, and so on. But again, underlying all of that is the whole politics of recognition, procedure, and distribution. So what one could think of in terms of who is the vulnerable, we could think of the existence of an energy underclass at the global scale, which lacks an socially. To think of what are and when we think of it in that way, it allows us to think what the political and technical economic relations that create these precarious publics are. What are the invisible, what are the, also in many ways, the more than human dynamics, because there's buildings and technology deeply implicated in this. And of course, we can then think of, in terms of Lloyd Kant, who talks about the precariat, we can think of this underclass as a group of people who are not yet aware of their own existence. Because what I've just said to you now is not something that you would find anywhere in press or in the media, the fact that we have a global energy provision problem at the moment. So in terms of this whole energy precariat, maybe with one way we could think about it, is that basically we could think of energy precariat both linked to materialities and social reproduction in everyday life, but also discourse, issues of power, knowledge, and systems of signification. We can go back to this if you want to talk about it later. Right, so how do we connect these two things? How do we connect transition and vulnerability? Well, I would argue that every transition process, inherent in any transition process, is a rise in vulnerability. So the vulnerabilities we have now and the vulnerabilities that we might experience as a result of the low-carbon transition are basically an inherent product of the transition process. I would say that there are three dimensions that are important here. Changes in the socio-technical provision of energy, the nature of economic transformation, and the political reconfigurations that accompany the transition process. They themselves result in new types of energy practices as in the materialities with which we engage with energy. They create different types of energy efficiencies, because, as we saw before, coal is less efficient than oil is less efficient than gas is more efficient than nuclear. Every time you introduce a new type of energy system, you create a different type of relation in the energy chain. They create new affordabilities. Providing nuclear is expensive. Providing renewables in particular context is expensive. Having coal existing in the energy balance is cheap. So that in itself is embedded in the nature of vulnerability. And most importantly, they create new power relations. So you can think of the current energy predicament of the world not as a predicament in which nation states compete for energy, not as a predicament in which geopolitics matters as much as we'd like to think, but as a predicament in which types of energy resources compete with each other, and a predicament in which corporate actors compete with each other. The current debate we have in the UK is not about are we going to get our gas or our LNG or our nuclear from here or there. It is about, is it going to be nuclear versus gas versus this versus that? Underlying that, of course, is the British state going to give money to the French utility, or is it going to give money to the German utility? And of course, here, if you think of those corporate actors, and I've had a chat with a guy called Tim Foxon who's done some great work on this, they are hybrid entities, these corporate entities now in the energy sector, because of this neoliberalizing process which we have seen over the last 30 years. They're no longer pure corporate entities, they're clientelistic entities which work very closely in alignment with the state. So the French utility, it's not, you don't quite know where the French state ends and where the utility begins. The Czech utility, which I mentioned before in the Bulgarian protest, well, is it a Czech state or is it the utility? Because then I read in the newspaper yesterday, Bulgaria is going to have a spat with the Czech Republic over this, and I'm thinking, why should the Bulgaria have a spat with the Czech Republic over this? Isn't this the Czech utility? How? So you're beginning to see that actually the current situation that we're experiencing at the moment, in terms of this post or this kind of neoliberal situation, or neoliberalizing situation in some cases, post-neoliberal situation, because of actually the system has already been liberalized, is a very, very complex one in terms of who actually you're engaging with. But it's fundamentally not the kind of, the traditional kind of thinking which a lot of people would still like you to believe, oh, is Russia going to provide energy to Europe, or is it going to be this or that? No, it's about power, and it's about the kind of choices of energy system that we make. And there's a fascinating political ecology project there. One interesting thing, I think I've got a few more minutes just to talk about this. Yeah. Okay. I won't talk about it. No, I was mentioning the interesting thing that people have developed is this whole notion of the energy ladder to describe how technologically societies move from one type of energy provision to another in terms of consumption. So this very linear. So they say, for example, in a society which is less developed, you get, and of course, and then the energy services are also less developed. You get very basic energy services. You get things like cooking, heating, and lighting, and of course you provide that through biomass, candles, and batteries. As the development of the society, well, actually the wealth of the society increases, you will be getting those kind of same services, but you will be getting them maybe through kerosene, through batteries, and so on. And then ultimately the same energy services, you will be getting them from things like gas, electricity, so there'll be a more kind of technological level, higher level of technological sophistication. But as your income increases, you'll get other energy services. So you'll get things like transport, basic appliances, refrigeration, water pumps, and then ultimately, if you are really developing the money, lots of money and so on, then you've got things like ICT, information technology, cooling, and you basically you've moved from a situation where you're just getting things from biomass candles to electricity, oil, and so on. So the kind of this model, which is called energy stacking, this is called the energy ladder, and then there's energy stacking of services. Is quite a simplistic way, but it's used quite a lot in energy and development, just to describe basically the types of the transitions that are experienced in terms of energy consumption at the level of energy, at the level of the household. Now, to me, I mean, going back, if I were to just apply what I just said to this very simplistic framework, if I were to think about the politics of all of this, and I were to think about vulnerabilities, I would actually say that the most important factor for me in all of this is where you, as an energy agent or an energy user, are located spatially and located politically. And so in many ways, you could be vulnerable. You could be vulnerable in a very low income society. You could, using the same services as you could be in a very high income society. So your level of vulnerability does not necessarily depend on the level of technological sophistication. It actually depends. It actually depends on the level to which you have been recognized as a relevant energy subject in that society, and you have access to the right kinds of infrastructures. So in other words, vulnerability can exist in a whole range of society. And again, ultimately, it depends on the political and technological setup in which that society works, not necessarily on the level of sophistication of energy service. So that's just, I just use this to, I don't know how much I got it across because I only have 2 minutes, but it's just to kind of demonstrate to you the validity of this model in terms of actually applying it to a whole range of energy consumption or transition situations. And just kind of, trying to think about vulnerability, well, what I would say is that it embodies itself multiple scales, multiple temporalities, multiple environments. So vulnerability is not something that you can easily reduce to a situation of yes or no, which I think is important because it allows us then to think of the agent vulnerability in relation to dynamics of socio-technical exclusion, which again tells us how much energy systems are basically overdetermined with politics. Okay, so it's 12:15. Right, thank you.